Hello, welcome back to our final opening event, a keynote lecture from Warren Ellis. I'm not going to talk for long, save to introduce the moderator for this evening's session, Dan Hessler-Forrest, Professor of Cultural Studies at Utrecht University.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Tobias. Wow, we've got like a full house here. This is awesome. Hello, my name is Dan. I'm going to just say a few words before Warren comes up here, the guy you're all come to listen to. Before we do that, I just figured I do a little interactive thing. Like, how many people here read comic books? Like a lot. Oh, that's good. This bodes well for this evening. Because it says I'm an assistant professor and I do have academic credentials, but the way I see it is I'm just a giant nerd who gets to interact with students a lot and talk about science fiction whenever the opportunity arises, which is what we'll try and do this evening. Are there people here who've never read a comic book by Warren Ellis? You can, I won't tell, okay? Just don't look back. Okay, so a bunch of people, because it just, what are you doing here? It's just so weird introducing somebody of this kind of stature to an audience, because you don't do the thing when Tobias introduces me, you're like, oh, so this guy, okay, so he's an academic and he does cultural studies and stuff. But for Warren, it's he's been around as an author in this field of cultural production for so long that the only way that seemed appropriate to sort of say a few things about him was doing a little autobiographical introduction. So I came to comics weirdly late for somebody who's such a nerd. I started reading comics seriously, as an adult, I think in the mid-1990s. So I started off with the things that comic book stores tend to thrust at you, Alan Moore's Watchmen and Frank Miller's Batman, The Dark Knight Returns. And then these are gateway drugs, right? You read these and you think wow, comic books can be really interesting, and they can be very mature and very deep. And very complex and very layered. And then by some stroke of good luck, some dude in a comic book store, maybe Yitza, who's right here, said, you should read Transmetropolitan. Because I'd been reading comic books for just a few months, and I was already really sick and tired of superheroes. So no, this is not a superhero. This is a serialized comic book that's about a gonzo journalist in the future who ends up basically, it's kind of a spoiler, but bringing down a terrifically evil douchebag president that a lot of people for some reason think is charming and off-kilter and genuine. He's nicknamed the Smiler. He's got the populist vote. So right after the election, the first fucking thing I did was pick up Transmetropolitan and start rereading it. And the way in which Warren's ideas about the interaction between media, between pop culture, between science fiction tropes and politics continuously infect each other in really messy ways. That's the thing that I really, that I have admired most about his work. You can pick up the issues here. But I got to warn you, this is one thing, right? There's a whole bunch. They're collected. Transmetropolitan. It's only one of many things he's done, but it's collected in a whole bunch of trade paperbacks. You start with one, and you think I'll just try it, but I'll tell you right now, if you read the first one, you're sold. You're going to have to collect every one of them, whether you've been reading comic books or not. He said in a recent lecture, science fiction is no longer just a literary genre. It's something that has come to infect the very fabric of our life. And to me, I find that both liberating and depressing, right? This idea that we're both sort of, science fiction is now everywhere. It's on Netflix, it's on HBO, it's in our pockets when we grab our smartphones all the time. But at the same time, it's so is this the future that we were promised all those years? Is this the amazing tech, the amazing hauntology that we're living with? I'm not sure. It's also branded. It's also cheesy. It doesn't always work. Anyway, those are, I think, some of the things that I took away from reading Warren's work. He's going to talk to us about it just to tell you how the evening's going to progress, hopefully, in an orderly fashion. Warren's going to talk for about half an hour. Right there. Then I'm going to come back on stage, and we're going to attempt to have some kind of conversation for about another half hour, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. If there are none, we'll all retreat to the bar immediately, but I'm expecting there will be at least a few. Anyway, give it up for Warren Ellis.
I'm going to apologise in advance for having the plague and therefore doing this reading in an extremely doomy voice. Yeah, that might happen a lot. All right, here we go. I spoke at the original Haunted Machines event in Manchester, discussing the confluence of technology and the stories of deep time. We have 3 topics this year: myth, magic, and monsters. I was asked to speak about myth because, like myths these days, I'm very old and rarely seen in the wild. So here we are again for the first time. Because, as old Heraclitus said, nobody ever steps in the same river twice. We are here tonight within the northernmost branch of the delta of the River Rhine. The Romans built Utrecht on the River Ford here. The crooked Rhine of Utrecht is all but cut off from the main branch now, but it retains the name. It's a canal that haunts a river. The Lorelei lays on the Rhine. Lorelei means murmuring rock. The Lorelei is a 130-metre tall chunk of slate that amplifies the sounds of a nearby waterfall and the strong currents in the Rhine at that point. All the myths around the Lorelei are about lurking dangers and siren songs that draw you in. What the myths actually mean is that the section of river around the Lorelei is very treacherous for ship navigation. It's not the music of the river that will kill you, it's the riptides. But when you hear the music, you remember the story and you act to not be drawn into the rocks. Myth is the carrier wave on the river of time. The Rhine runs all the way past Düsseldorf in Germany, where Michael Rother of Neu stood and imagined a new kind of music. He said of the river, it's like time, and it's also like a picture of music. The future flowed from there to here, caught in the crooked arm of a ghost river, and here we all are. I've read that you've got a river of words here, the letters of Utrecht. Every Saturday, you add another paving stone containing one single letter to a poem you started in 2012. In another 350 years or so, the lines of the poem will have formed the letters U and T at such size that they will have become part of the map of the city. I love that. Another 1,750 years after that, you will have cut the name of the city into the city at map scale. It was inspired by the clock of the long now, a mechanical clock that would only tick once a year, with a hand that would only move once a century for 10,000 years. They've still only created prototypes, but you did this. A river of words that rolls into the future that will only speak its complete statement to the people in this city a couple of thousand years from now. Words so big that they mark the city from orbit. And with a bit of luck, the final words of the poem would be, and fuck Geert Wilders forever. You know, that better be a good poem. If that turns out to be a 2 millennia long gag that ends with a limerick about dicks, your descendants will dig you up and desecrate your corpses. Changing the map, haunting it with a poem. I am walking in an unknown street when suddenly ghosts appear in front of me. That is how the mathematician René Descartes begins his description of the 3 visions he had one night when living by the banks of the Danube River. That changed his approach to science, which changed everybody's approach to science. He was French, but he did most of his work living in the Netherlands. The first dream is of him being lost amongst ghosts. The second, of a large explosion. And the third is of an unknown man appearing and presenting him with a poem, which starts with the words, "What is and is not." Upon awakening, he begins the process of sorting what is from what is not. Myth and science are separated. Science enumerates and measures, and myth only speaks in murmurs from the river's edge. The real world is a world of mathematical properties, and we can tell what is real and what is not. Mostly. All started by Descartes, a guy who locked himself in a room by the river, where he'd banked up the stove to the point where he was having heat-induced hallucinations in his sleep. Who decided his visions were real wisdom? We're all doomed. That was the break. That was the point at which alchemy split into measure and number on the one hand, and magic and myth on the other. Isaac Newton, born 7 years before Descartes died, was the other great actor in this separation, a British astronomer, mathematician and physicist who was also an alchemist. Alchemy was really the most developed science of its time. Scientific observation and magic, poems indivisible from spells, and lots of large explosions. Spells are nothing but poems intended to write something new on the face of reality. He wrote something over 1 million words in his lifetime in pursuit of the philosopher's stone, an alchemical concept whose first recorded mentions date back to the time of Socrates. It's strongly believed that the philosopher's stone was never truly believed to be a possible physical object, but was in fact a metaphor for some set of ultimate knowledge or tools about consciousness, existence, and reality. A physicist looking for a technology of metaphysics. It was a myth in search of transmission of its truth. In the book, The Ends of the World, by Deborah Donofsky and Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, there is this line. Maybe, as Levi Strauss often remarked, science, which started out by separating itself from myth, will eventually encounter it once again at the end. But myth is the carrier wave. Human beings are hardwired for storytelling. We make stories out of everything. The earliest earthworks and megaliths are all about dramatizing the landscape, enhancing the stories we see in them. And we did the same with the sky. Gordon White's book on myth, Starships, makes a very important point very clearly. Once we began making stories about the night sky, astrological myths conjured up from the shapes the stars form, we began an important process. Astrology leads to astronomy. We perceive and understand the repeating patterns and positions. We measure and record. We do the work of science. And astronomy leads to navigation. The positions of the stars and planets at night become the markers that guide our way. Astrology leads to astronomy, which leads to navigation. Or put another way, myth transmits a technology through time via storytelling. What is not becomes the carrier wave for what is. On some level, a myth is always a true story, and the machine is always haunted. When we do these events, we're talking about how science and magic are intertwined, how technology is informed by folklore at every step. We do, in fact, live in the age when science and myth have met again. In the days before science, the only tools Socrates had to describe self-reflective consciousness and cognition was to create myth. He told people the story that he possessed a daemon, an intercessor spirit that influenced his decision-making, a voice that told him what is and what is not. Daemons exist today. That's the name for computer programs that run as background processes without the direct control of the user. The machine is always haunted. We always put myths inside of them. In that same book, The Ends of the World, I came across this wonderful term. Mythophysics. They write, Jorge Luis Borges' well-known quip on metaphysics being a branch of fantastic literature requires that the converse be true. Fantastic literature and science fiction are the pop metaphysics or mythophysics of our time. The literature of the fantastic has always been one part myth to one part social fiction. We transmit what we see and what we believe to be true through the carrier of story. If you were an alchemist who was also a physicist, metaphysics would be a subset of physics. Myth and physics, mythophysics, connected all along, as if alchemy had never split, and as if someone had slapped Descartes and told him to lay off the mushrooms. And here's our wicked problem. Mythophysics is both old and new, and either through its novelty or the separation that saw it confined to the haunted dark for a few hundred years, we haven't gotten good at it. Levi Strauss notes that outright mythical thought passed to the background in Western thought during that time of separation. But at the same time, the first novels began to appear. Mythic lore begins its alchemical transmutation into popular culture. The monomyth gets iterated. Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. The near algorithmic combination of all the world's most enduring epics into a single template. It has no power or significance or information to transmit now. It's been cooked down into a 12-step timeline that's in everything from Star Wars to Lord of the Rings to every single bloody Marvel movie. This is not mythophysics. We have on some level lost control of storytelling. The other thing that was beginning to change was what must have seemed like the near eternal state of under-communication. For almost all of human history, it was nigh impossible to know what was going on in the rest of the world, and information could only be transmitted by spoken word and single documents in the forms most resistant to degradation. Ghost stories and poems built on the myth of mythology, built on the model, of mythology. And today, we exist in a never-before-seen condition of over-communication. Almost anyone in almost any place in the world can know much of what's going on in the rest of the world. We now live on an incredibly loud planet. Measure and number have put magic mirrors in our pockets that can show us storms on the other side of the planet, haunted by our own machines, to the point where a lot of us seem to forget they come with off switches. And you know what else they show us? They show us fascists getting asked their opinions about things on mainstream news. Fascism coming from a Roman word for a bundle of rods, the fasces. The same Romans who frequently recorded that they knew when it was safe to ford a river because the gods told them so. We forget things as a culture. Myth is the way to preserve the things that matter. The warnings from deep time and the ways to navigate away from the rocks. It's the carrier wave for civilization. But thanks to a half-reformed alchemist who wanted to make a magic rock, and a mathematician who lost his shit in a room that was too hot, we became convinced that we didn't need myths anymore. And what happened after that is that we proved why we needed those resonant mythic forms murmuring down the ages. We're really, really good at forgetting things. It took us just 70 years to forget why we don't put fucking Nazis on television. I'm pissed off. I admit it. When we started doing this event, it was just called Haunted Machines. It almost feels decadent now, having that space to talk about occultism in technology and the secret stories that underpin our tools and society. A couple of years later, and now we're Haunted Machines and Wicked Problems, because it's just been that kind of a couple of years. Storytelling has been subverted in ways I used to write satirical fiction about in the last century. And now we treat the news like pop culture, and we treat reality television like news. A significant proportion of the world population can't tell the difference anymore, including a lot of the perpetrators. How many times have you heard the words fake news in the last year, in the last month? It's like a spell cast over a truth that's already drowning in the river. Have you tried watching CNN? Or even BBC News 24, or BBC World, whatever it's called now. All they're missing is a fucking astrologer. So here we are, standing in shouting distance of a ghost river, where you're conjuring a spell in stone that's writing something both new and old on the face of the city. This is as good a place as any to make the stand for mythophysics. We need to look forward, but we can rarely see where we've gone unless we can Yeah, let me try that again. We can really see where we're going unless we can first see where we've been. The river always needs to point into the future, but we navigate it with the lessons learned from the stories of the past. Myth has context. Myth has information and tools. Myth is a solid stone step towards civilization. And we build it by the river, where we can hear the resonant music of the future. Myth is memory. If we take anything from this haunted week of wicked problems, it's that millennia of human culture worked to give us the tools to survive the future and to remember our ghosts. The people who came before us did not do all that, did not tell all those stories, just for us to steer into the rocks. It's on us to preserve those stories and provide the new myths and warnings to those who come after us, so that they get to finish the poem. And if it's a shit poem, we get to come back and haunt all of them. Thanks for your time.
Whoopsie daisy. Okay. Thank you, Warren. Okay. That was a lot to process.
There was a lot to read.
So, I hate to be the academic who immediately starts with like an academic sounding name, but you brought up Levi Strauss.
Oh, here we go. Hot up on cold
okay.
meds, and let's do the academic.
Here we go. So, you were talking about myth, and Levi Strauss, if I remember correctly, like for him, myths are so important to a society or to a culture because they're a way to understand or make sense of irresolvable contradictions. Right? He's a cultural anthropologist, Claude Levi Strauss.
Yeah, I mean, Viveiros de Castro is frankly a more valuable.
There you
go. Not least because, you know, he's actually in Brazil. I'm not convinced I want to do an exegesis on Levi Strauss because he got so much backwards.
No, but I'm just doing it as a build-up to Star Trek, so, you know, you can go there.
Why isn't there any whiskey? Jesus. Let's just go straight to Star Trek.
Okay, so to me, as a 20th century person living in the 21st century, right? That's how I would see myself. Mm-hmm. To me, like a lot of the technology that we use right now feels literally magical. You know, like when I get on a plane and I'm like, and they're like, would you like Wi-Fi? And I'm like, are you shitting me? You know, that's
so what you're saying is actually advertising works on you. Yeah. Because what you've forgotten, but it's stuck in the back of your head like a poison dart, all of Steve Jobs' PR around the iPad was based around the word magic.
Yes.
It works magically. And look at how it looks. Look at how it works. You point at it with your finger like a fucking wizard, and it does something. Yes.
And that's how I thought technology would be. Like technology on Star Trek, right? Technology on James Bond, technology on the old Mission Impossible TV show, right? It all worked, and it worked perfectly, and it worked beautifully, and it wasn't branded. And I remember there was one point where I remember it so vividly. I went, oh fuck, we are in the future and it sucks. It was the moment when I was watching Mission Impossible 4 with Tom Cruise, right, the movie. And I'd seen all the Mission Impossible movies, the old Mission Impossible TV shows, and it's about a team of super spies who work for the government. They're the Impossible Missions Force, right, IMF. And in this movie, all of a sudden, the technology that they had was literally Apple iPads and Apple iPhones. And it was like, shit, you know, I never thought that the technology, like I always thought in some way that we would reach some kind of utopian techno paradise. maybe, hopefully.
I'm from the 27th century. I don't understand why I even have to hold any of this stuff. Consider me interested, but always vaguely disappointed.
Yeah. But isn't there some? Yeah.
I was just thinking. I actually binge watched like an old season of Mission Impossible the other week for a work thing, and you're right about how none of it was branded, because Barney, who had his own electronics company, built it all.
Yeah.
And it was just this one guy.
Like Q on James Bond, right?
Yeah.
This is a nerd in a cellar building amazing stuff that works.
Yeah, it's literally, we need a cutting laser that fits in a condom. Well, funnily enough.
Yes.
Yeah, but I've got to warn you, Jim, the reservoir tip is quite big.
So the idea that now we have basically that stuff, kind of. It works, kind of, and it's, you can buy it, right?
Yeah.
But what you're buying, but the world that surrounds it.
Right, because you're also, but this is coming back to Star Trek, you're a tech head.
Yeah.
None of the tech in Star Trek was ever branded.
No.
It was provided by the culture as a whole, because they were a post-money, post-capitalist,
inclusive, diverse, post-scarcity.
Post-scarcity was the term I was looking for, thank you. Society where the society produces everything for the society. It is, in fact, fully automated luxury communism.
Exactly. Our dream, right? So now, right? Okay. So now we're going to go deep in Star Trek now, because now Star Trek is back, right? And we were talking about this over a cigarette before. Star Trek is back, and I was very excited because it was called Star Trek Discovery, right? This idea that now we could, in the 21st century, where our biggest problem is that there is no alternative, right? There is no alternative to global capitalism, and that kind of communism, right?
Well, I mean, let me actually just be a dick about it.
Go ahead.
Star Trek Discovery was terrific branding for all the Trek fans who had missed the utopian framework from the 3 recent Star Trek movies. So I think Star Trek Discovery, if nothing else, was a big flag to the Star Trek fans who had access to the internet and wanted to watch it on television again. I would love to impute a deeper storytelling intent to that title, but I have my doubts.
Okay. Well, us academics, we overinterpret everything.
Well, I mean, thank God for you guys, because it makes our job so much fucking easier. I shat this out, but this guy got a whole monograph making me look good.
So the word you just used is branding, and at the end of your talk just now, you were talking about storytelling, and this fact that storytelling, in a way, every kind of storytelling that we now get seems to be overshadowed by its generic
it's templated. It's why, in a way, I mean, people have been talking about having AIs create movies. Here's the thing about that. AI and processing and storage costs a lot of money. And the only way you're going to make that money back is if you have the AI make summer blockbusters. So you're going to teach the machine with every summer blockbuster of the last 12 years, and what it's going to produce is largely indivisible to the summer blockbusters we have now. They're either going to be underlit or overlit. They're not going to make a lot of sense, and there'll be a lot of explosions and crying at the end. We don't actually need an AI to do that. We're making those already. Summer blockbuster storytelling is already so heavily templated. You can see the beats coming a mile off because everything's been audience tested to within an inch of its life. All the numbers have been crunched as compares to runtime, budget take, domestic take, international take. It's already as close to an algorithmic product as you need for those purposes anyway. Anything released between March and September from Hollywood, frankly, is gonna, at a certain budget, is going to hit those beats.
And still, like, a lot of people talk about those things. They talk about Batman, Superman, Iron Man, Star Wars, Harry Potter, you know, as myths. Are they myths? Would you consider those modern myths?
They have elements of it. I mean, Iron Man in itself becomes almost more mythic all the time. Before any of those films happened, I wrote an Iron Man graphic novel when they didn't really know what to do with the character. And I said, he's a technologist, he's the test pilot for the future. He's a futurist, he's the test pilot for the future. And that's essentially that essentially became the tank they used for the film, which is why you get people like Elon Musk doing cameos. It becomes a myth of the super rich technologist who is active in the society. So yeah, you can always, cherry pick out, if you like, what we would like to believe these movies are really about. But the fact they all have the same plot shape makes it difficult.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's like a regurgitation of an already familiar mythological story.
Yeah, it's mostly the hero's journey template. Yeah. It's, I think the only Iron Man film that didn't hit that exact template was Iron Man 3. All the others, create a mentor figure to knock off and,
Okay. So, just this week I've been reading a book called Alt America about the rise, the visible rise of white supremacy and neo-fascism in the U.S. and the way that it's been fostered by this climate of, you mentioned the term fake news, but this idea that we're all in algorithm culture, right? So we're being fed media in a way that tends to reassure us about our previous convictions. So a lot of the myths that tend to feed, white supremacist thinking, fascist thinking, those seem like those people are way into mythology, right? Or you go onto these websites, they're full of Norse mythology.
The alt-right are, yeah, because they're casting around sections of the alt-right, like all right-wing organisations, are looking at some founding myth that gives them complete cultural legitimacy. So they look for stories of an Aryan race, or the whole Norse thing, and the idea that they're coming out of a Norse tradition.
And it's a very selective reading, right?
It's hugely selective because it has to be, but they are at heart, I think, searching for some kind of legitimacy, some hard ground to put their feet on and say, we belong here and here's why.
Yeah,
it's the soil part of Blood and Soil.
Yeah, there's a friend of mine in the U.S. is medievalist, and he's having a tough time because the Nazis loved the Middle Ages. They're like, that's when our culture was pure. And his job is like, no. I'm a historian, and there was nothing pure or white about the culture in the Middle Ages. It's just that's sort of your mythological projection. Is that?
Well, I mean, in Britain there was this huge row because it's been proven many times, but it was proven again. There were black people, there were people of colour in Britain during the Roman occupation times, and the right were outraged because they, for reasons that frankly escape me, imagine the Romans as some pure white race.
Yeah. In part because the colors washed off the statues, right? That's one of the things. Right?
Presumably,
because the colors, the statues were like painted in all these different
I don't know
colors.
how they can believe that in one respect and take their easy jet holidays in fucking Italy on the other, but...
So if I followed your line of thinking in the talk, is mythology a way to come to terms with the past of a culture? And is science a way
it's also a way to communicate forward. There's been this big project. There's a huge dump of radioactive material somewhere in the States that's going to take like 10 or 20,000 years to eat out its half-life and become vaguely safe. So they've been trying to come up with some form of indestructible, massive signage for this dump that someone 10,000 years from now will be able to translate as, this is radioactive, don't grow anything here.
I'm guessing it's not in the shape of a poem around this side.
Not in the shape of a poem. I believe it's like a mile-long slab of concrete with, every version of "fuck off, you'll die" written on it. But it's almost like, there are parts of northern England that have ghost stories or boggart stories attached to them, just because they were like natural locations that were quite dangerous to hang around. Mm-hmm. If you screw around on the rocks by this waterfall, you'll die. But people are stupid, so you can't just say that to them. In order to communicate down, something's going to come out of the water and grab you.
Yeah.
That's what sticks with people for whatever reason, because, I don't know, we're essentially stupid or something. And so, things... It's almost like needing a way to work on that level. It's subtext, but it's also direct. And there are pure forms of storytelling involved,
Mm-hmm. Another definition, though, that I'm sort of struggling with all of the negative associations that I have with myth as well, right? The idea that myths also function to kind of justify the status quo of a culture, that they are often used to sort of, to reproduce the hierarchical organization of a society? Or is that not the way you perceive
Not all of them.
Not all of them.
That's the thing for every one you cite in that respect.
Yeah.
There's one in the Norse mythology about the gods being idiots.
Yes.
And that you shouldn't trust authority because sometimes authority is unearned, and those people are just stupid as rocks.
Yeah.
Almost every other story about Thor in the original myths is about Thor being a fucking idiot.
But that is one of the problems. I'm just thinking about the problems of storytelling today that you mentioned. Is one of the problems that we lack a lively and dynamic contemporary reservoir of mythology. I mean, Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings because he was like, we don't have a great, Celtic mythology that we need. I need to fill up that reservoir. Well, that's what he was thinking, right?
Yeah, I'm going to need a cigarette and probably a big stick if we're going to talk about Tolkien.
We don't have to go to Tolkien if you don't want to.
Because, there were things above and beyond with Tolkien, and it's no surprise some people in the alt-right really liked Lord of the Rings. I had it in my head a second ago, and it's gone because you enraged me by mentioning Lord of the Rings.
Sorry.
Fucking elves and shit. Partly it's... because the current space is so uncomfortable for so many people, there is a lot more television based around period work than I think there used to be, particularly in the States. I mean, in Britain, there's always been a lot of period television because it meant we didn't have to buy new clothes for anybody. In America, oddly, there is more period set television than I think there's ever been before, because the contemporary condition is so uncomfortable. And I think in talking about myths in the way to communicate what we're learning now to the future involves engaging with the here and now in a way a lot of people are not very comfortable with.
Right.
And I think in a lot of ways it's time to grit our teeth and actually make something contemporary about the contemporary space and what's coming next.
Right.
Rather than something else set in the 1960s.
Yeah. So is science fiction a good genre to do that in? Because a lot of people think science fiction is about the future, but
science fiction is never about the future.
There you go. Okay.
Never. Science fiction is always about the present moment. 1984 was about 1948, when Orwell was writing the book. He just reversed out the numbers and made it into science fiction, because setting something in the future gives you an additional set of tools with which to examine the present day condition. It gives you access to a bunch of metaphors and a bunch of angles that you don't have before. Science fiction is always social fiction. And if it's not, then throw it in the bin, because they're not doing it right. Yes, I'm ill, I'm ranting now. Work with me.
But if science fiction is about the now, right, is it also, then what you were just suggesting is also...
Well, it's about the now and it's about what's next.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're doing the McLuhan thing of only seeing the present through the rearview mirror,
Yeah.
which means you're only ever seeing what's just happened. It's future facing.
Speculative. Speculative fiction is the term that people who don't really want to use the word science fiction use to talk about science fiction, right? It's like graphic novels.
It's the one I use
comic.
depending on where I am.
I know. I'm not a comic book writer. I'm a graphic novel auteur.
I never say auteur. I need slaves to draw them.
So what
This isn't being live streamed, is it? Oh, God.
So if science fiction is social fiction, right? And what could it do for us? I mean, I'm always looking around like what can tell us what's next?
It's the early warning system. Again, 1984, Brave New World. You take what you perceive to be the present day condition, and you look at something that you think is just about to happen. And using science fiction, you can draw it down into your present day laboratory and examine it from very many angles before it gets here. The science fiction writer is the early warning system, it's the weather station. These are the possible storms that are going to be generated from this one thing I've pulled down from the future.
Right.
That's the worth of science fiction and social fiction.
Right.
One of them.
One of them. So a lot of people writing about science fiction have always made this weird, like absolute distinction between fantasy, right, which is magical and mythological and reactionary, right, and science fiction, which is rational and speculative and therefore progressive. What do you think?
I'd argue a lot of those things. Science fiction is speculative. I don't think it ever needs to be rational, and frequently isn't. Although I'm not a fan of fantasy, I wouldn't necessarily consider it reactionary. A lot of fantasy almost acts like an alternate history or a counterfactual. I mean, Game of Thrones is fantasy, dragons and what have you, but it's also the British War of the Roses. He just changed the names.
Right.
So he's part of what he does there is examine the War of the Roses and the way that medieval wars in hugely inbred societies with lots of unearned authority actually did. It's speculative, but it's not future-facing.
Right. Okay.
You can still speculate in a historical context.
Yeah.
It's just they're not future-facing.
Yeah. Okay. So as a final question, because I'm getting warning signs over here that this conversation is becoming too boring and we need to start cutting it off.
Is it time for us to shut up?
As somebody who, has quite the track record in science fiction, speculative fiction, magical fiction, and this is a warning system, right? How badly screwed are we?
Oh, we're doomed.
Okay.
Sorry. Don't go outside. Stay in here. I don't know. Every 5 years, everyone says, "Oh my God, things have never been this bad. This is nuts." And then, there's a new hot TV show on and everyone goes to bed for 5 years. And then 5 years' time, "Oh my God, we're all screwed. All the cats and dogs are on fire." And 5 years later, I don't know. I'm just rolling with it at this point.
Okay.
Yeah, I grew up under the Margaret Thatcher years. We looked out of the windows every morning to see if she'd put Daleks on the streets.
Okay. Thank you, Warren. We're going to open up the floor to questions, which I'm assuming by now there must be. Natalie's got the first one over there. There's 2 mics. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand clearly, and if you're lucky, I'll notice it and point to you, and somebody with a microphone will come up.
One of the secret reasons of inviting people to festivals is I can get them to ask some questions. So I read Normal, which is your book about abyss gaze, which has now become, as someone who's worked in futures for the past 5 years, a very, very regular term now, I feel, for me. the role of the futurist is often quite a mythological one, both sort of in contemporary society and obviously in your work you kind of do extrapolate that quite wildly. And I kind of wanted to ask you what you think the role of a futurist should be now, considering that you have these kind of dual things of like the scary, angry ones and the ones who are like Elon Musk. But I'd like to hear your opinion about that.
This is part of the problem, because my interaction with futurists has always tended to split between people who want to tell me about their new idea for an app bank. I remember someone actually doing this, and then someone saying, but banks are evil. And the guy says, no, but we'll be a nice kind of bank. And it reminded me of an old story Grant Morrison wrote, where the bad guy gets called up for what he's doing and says, this is Hitler-esque. And the bad guy says, but I thought I'd be a nice kind of Hitler. It's people like that. And on the other hand, it's people who work in climate change futures, geoengineering futures, whose job is to try and save us every day, but their job turns out just to be thinking about how we're all doomed every day. And then after a while, someone puts a shitload of Valium in them and they have to go to bed for 18 months because it's hard work. What I always miss, I think, is people trying to find the way out rather than just pointing out all the no exit signs.
Up there. Yeah.
So during your talk with Dan, you were quite critical of the way big Hollywood blockbusters nowadays tell the story. And in your talk, you specifically mentioned Marvel movies. So when Iron Man 3 kind of, maybe sort of, adapted your extremist story, right?
Kinda, sorta, ish.
So with your criticism on
it didn't break the template because of my book. They only used part of my book. The things they did that were different to that template were original to Drew Pearce and Shane
Black. Shane Black.
Thank you. Yeah. No, that wasn't me patting myself on the back. That was Drew and Shane Black.
So, but what did you think of seeing parts of your story adapted as this big Hollywood blockbuster, like the storytelling and the way it?
You know what my one takeaway from that is? Did you see the film?
Yeah, I did.
Did you notice how I'm now the president of the Marvel Universe? They call the president of the United States in Iron Man 3, and therefore the Marvel Universe, is named Ellis, which was one of their little thank yous to me. So I've got to state my bias up front. I'm president of an entire universe now. And quite rightly, I think. So, I actually enjoyed the film. Like Drew Pearce, he started out writing in British comedy, and he's just got a great ear. You can hear him in all those Mandarin scenes. And I thought the movie was perfectly entertaining. No one wants to ask now. They're intimidated by my presidency.
Over here.
Hello. I'm a very big fan of yours, and a friend of mine is as well. But he has the misfortune of studying in London right now. So I...
Oh, I see how it is already.
I'm saying right now because he was very annoyed he couldn't be here. So I offered him my question, which I now slightly regret. Will you ever finish Dr. Sleepless, you fucking fuck? I'm so sorry.
Which one's the live stream camera? Up there? Yeah, there we go. Yeah. You see me there? Yeah. Fuck you.
Thank you.
Over here.
Yeah, so you talked about the myth being the message to the from the past to the future in a way. How much would you say that myth is conscious? Because you say, okay, we have a river, don't go near there or you'll die. But you can't tell it straightly to people, so we'll make a giant story around it of a monster coming to grab you. How much do you think that is actually somebody thinking, okay, I can't tell this directly, so let's make a story? Or somebody hearing, you can't go near the river or you'll die? Why is that? Maybe there is a monster in there.
Partly it's because, honestly, I think we just make stories out of anything and everything. There's a megalithic site on Callanish in the Orkneys. It's a stone ring. And it's designed to tell a story twice a year. Summer solstice and winter solstice, which is the exact time of which the sun comes up over the mountains that surrounds the stone ring. But the mountain is slightly higher, it arcs around. And you have to turn around in the ring to watch the sun come up over the mountain range. And it dips behind the mountains and it struggles all the way up. And the stones become like movie frames, setting off each part of the sun's triumphant, eventually journey into the sky. That's something we made for a sunrise we only see twice a year. We make stories out of everything. Stories are what stick in our heads. It's what makes us remember things. And it would seem that telling a story about a siren that lives on a rock that will draw you in and you'll die on the rocks just seems to be more effective than don't go near there, you'll die. Because this is us. If someone says, just don't go near that, you'll die, I'm going to go and have a look.
That's interesting, yeah.
I'm going to go and have a look. And that's how people die.
I saw a hand going up there on the 6th row.
Thank you. So would you say that there is an expiration date on myth? Because you said like myth leads to art and to science, and maybe they'll meet up again in the future. But you could also argue that once we have science, myth is explained and no longer has a purpose.
I'm not sure because, myths survived and communicated for thousands and thousands of years and still do.
Yeah, I know, but theoretically.
But like I say, we forgot we're not supposed to put Nazis on fucking television. Whatever we're doing now instead of mythic storytelling doesn't seem to stick.
No. Who knows?
And yet people still tell the story of the Lorelei and the story of Spirit Tracks and Boggart's Gates.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Live and learn.
Over here.
You just said that Iron Man 3 was perfectly entertaining.
I thought
it's not going to make the poster, but is that the problem with today's stories, that they're just perfectly entertaining? Like we're in the worst of times. At least in the Thatcher times, we got like threads and that kind of stuff. And
yeah, I mean, you got to remember I'm the worst person to ask about this because I'm a working writer in 5 different storytelling fields, and I lost the ability to watch anything for pleasure years ago.
Is there anything in the popular culture?
I'm the arsehole in the back saying, "Well, he should have rewritten that line."
What is good out there? What is out there that is scaring the shit out of us right now at the moment in your kind of...
What's good and what's scaring the shit out of us?
Well, I mean, what's the good myths around the moment that are just jolting us out of the kind of coma?
That's actually a tough one. Because it is divisible from stuff I might personally like, I guess. I mean, I haven't seen the Jordan Peele movie.
Get Out.
Thank you, Get Out. But I'm told that's very strong and has that real mythic resonance to it. I mean, the last thing I watched that I enjoyed was probably the Twin Peaks Return.
Oh, yeah.
Even though I really, really wanted to strangle Dougie Jones.
But that's okay. Sorry, I got to jump in.
But
here.
there's a huge mythic thing in the middle. Episode 8. Here we go.
No, but I can't believe that didn't occur to me before. I was so stuck on my Star Trek fucking science fiction mind that didn't occur to me. But the thing that I so loved about Twin Peaks: The Return, as somebody who watches way too much television, is that like watching TV shows, watching these complex serialized arcs feels like labor to me at a certain point, because you're just keeping track of all the little threads. And there I was watching Twin Peaks: The Return, and it was literally impossible for me to predict what was going to happen in the next scene or even within a given scene, because it was drawing on the one hand on these deep mythic wells and this incredible sound and color and all those things, and at the same time its narrative was just this tapestry of weirdness that also makes sense. And that's a thing that I really miss in our, like, in narrative culture, right? Stuff that is also allowed to be a little bit more crazy, to go off the leash, to be mythical in a way that is not about making sense.
And he makes a statement, it's in episode 16 or 17, where Lynch, as Gordon Cole, goes into this monologue about how something got released by the explosion of the first atomic bomb, called Jiao Day, that people now call Judy. You haven't seen it? Natalie's plugging her ears because spoilers.
It's not spoilable. You can't spoil it. It's not spoilable.
He uses the term Jiao Day, which people now say Judy. Jiao Day is a Chinese term that means to explain. And Gordon Cole describes Jiao Day as an evil negative force. To explain is evil, in David Lynch's word. Well, yeah. To explain is an extreme negative force. And that was his statement about the entire show. Explanation is bad, just roll with it. I really wish you'd put it at the top of the show rather than
at the end.
Yeah. Explanation is an extreme negative force. Let's just roll with the next 18 hours, guys. Just stick with the Dougie Jones stuff. And yes, it's a myth of the atomic age. There's some strong mythic structures in there. But Twin Peaks was also interesting to me because it was the broad public historical sweep of the nuclear age and everything that followed. But every episode has a callback to a David Lynch project. It's also his summation of his career, which I found really interesting. It was. I hope he never makes anything again. I hate to say it. If Twin Peaks season 3 was just the capstone on his career, and he just goes off and meditates and eats quinoa for the rest of his life. I've got no idea if I answered the question. I've wandered miles away. Sorry.
We got one over here. Arjan.
Pessimistic one, and I hope you have a pessimistic question, and I hope you have an optimistic answer, or at least some hints to that. It's about narratives and storytelling. We see capitalism being very successful at that, Facebook reaching large audiences. What is your view on art events like this, trying to create different stories, different views, to become more successful and reach wider audiences, somehow be more effective in creating change?
It's always difficult because no matter what I talk about here, we're talking about existing within capitalism. So everything I'm going to talk about represents platform capitalism in some way. Because I'm sorry, people have been saying the term late capitalism for like 150 years now, and it seems to still be here. So sorry about that, it's really not going away soon. But there are forms of capitalism. Facebook is quite a pure form. It requires competition, and it requires the ability to kill and to punish in order to compete more effectively. So in terms of storytelling, particularly, I don't see Facebook being hugely successful in the near term. because it sows so much distrust in their partners. They claim they want to be partners with news companies, but they change the page algorithms every 3 months and reduce the unpaid reach those news companies have to their subscribed audiences. You have to give Facebook more money in order to reclaim part of the audience you already have. This is baked into Facebook. This is their financial model. And it means to do narrative video, they will have to engender trust in a way they haven't yet and probably never will. Netflix, on the other hand, are an oddly different concern. I'm never, even though I'd work with Netflix, I'm never going to portray them as, you know, the good angels of capitalism, because there's no such thing, let's be honest. But they have their audience. Their audience only comes to them one way. And the only way they can keep their audience is by showing them good art. And they have this fascinating process as a company where you come to them with a project and they will say either yes or no. And that is often the last you hear from them until you deliver the project. I did a show there and I had exactly 5 notes in one email from my Netflix executive that was headed up with the lines, "These are just some thoughts I have, take them or leave them." And so, you know, I'm not the only person to have said, you know, are you sure? You know, you're a TV executive, you should be, you know, pissing in my stew to improve the flavour for you at this point. I said, well, you know, if we didn't think you could make it, then we wouldn't have asked you to. Which sounds obvious, but you have to understand, for a TV company, that's unheard of. And that's a big part of why they get the material they get. So I think the hopes for storytelling going forward are in these non-traditional spaces where they didn't learn the bad lessons that have been inculcated in the rest of the storytelling industry. Amazon were a little different, but they're going through some changes right now, and I think they might lean towards that. And again, Amazon is evil. Don't get me wrong. We all know what Amazon does. But as a non-traditional outlet, it may get proved to produce some interesting art. And I think it'll be the places like that that do it. I think that's where the hope is.
We've got time for one more question, I guess. The pressure is on. I saw some fingers somewhere in the middle. No, over there.
So you were criticizing a bit the monomyth a bit, or is that? Do I get it right?
Use of it.
A bit. Yeah.
I don't see the point in criticizing the monomyth. It's a thing that exists.
Yeah.
It was the fact that most highly capitalized narrative art uses that structure as a crutch.
Yeah. So, but then again, you're kind of like saying bad stuff about David Lynch's work. David Lynch's use of the dream narrative.
No, I was saying bad stuff about the Dougie Jones scenes, particularly.
Dougie's great. Come on. But yeah, what exactly is then? What do you see as the ideal narrative then? If the monomyth is wrong, if an unstructured narrative is wrong.
I have no conception of an ideal narrative. An ideal narrative is like asking for utopia to be delivered. A utopian structure is a frozen structure that can't surprise you. I want to be surprised. I'm not looking for something that specifically fits my needs and wants and is tailored to me. I want to be surprised. I want to hear the new sound.
Right, so different rhythms, Slosky effect, that kind of...
Whatever it is, surprise me.
All right. Yeah. Well, that was it.
And that's the thing about Marvel too, though, isn't it? Somebody said, I was just reading a Thor Ragnarok review, and somebody said, I was hoping for a Taika Waititi film that was distributed by Marvel, but what I got was a Marvel film that happened to be directed by Taika Waititi. So it was kind of the idea that...
Well, that's what you're going to get. That's what he was hired to do.
Yeah, yeah.
I doubt he's sad about it. He was hired to come in and direct a film for Marvel.
Yeah.
It is, at best, a collaborative process. It's not going to be a Taika film. It's just going to have his flavour, because that's what it was hired for.
Yeah. I said somebody else over here had one more question, so the last question is over there. Yes, over there. Yeah.
I wonder if a film of the three-body problem might interest you.
I actually like The Dark Forest better, but it's probably even harder to film. But yeah, I would sit and watch a film version of The Three-Body Problem. Why? Have you got something in mind?
No, I think that we've been talking a lot about mythologies and sci-fi within a fairly limited spectrum of production. It's very Western, and
yes.
I'm not going to go into gender, but I think that there is, for me, that is really, it's the most profound experience of sci-fi I've had in a long time, just because it's set in such a completely different, it's coming from such a different place, and I can't even imagine what it's even like to read an original. I felt the translation was a bit clunky, but to imagine that on screen for me is like is a future, is like a real change, like a possible moment of change.
That's the thing. It speaks with such a different cultural voice. That's probably part of what gives it its power. But to be able to see a full expression of that culture's speculation on the big screen would be massive. That would be huge for a lot of people. I could see that.
Okay, that's all the time we've got, I'm afraid. We could listen to Warren for much, much longer than we have. I feel lucky to have been up here with you talking about Star Trek, Marvel, and we even got to express justifiable outrage about Tolkien, and we ended up somehow getting Twin Peaks into the mix. So I will be forever grateful. Thank you so much, Warren. I hope to talk to you again. Great.